jazz pianist and inspirational speaker, described the best teachers as kind of like jazz performers. So there's this kind of aspect of improvisation, being able to kind of move with the flow. And so that's what we're going to provide the opportunity for here. And Dr. Jennifer Gregg from the Communications Department is going to moderate this discussion. I don't know what format she's got planned. There may not be any particular format, but we're going to get to participate. So without further ado, Dr. Jennifer Gregg.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate being invited to participate because this has been a wonderful event that you have put on today, and I appreciate being here and meeting many of the folks that I sort of work with remotely in my job as a communication professor here. So I think the way we'll go about this tonight is, because I'm the moderator, I get to ask the first question. And then if you have a question, we're a small enough group, you can stand or raise your hand. I would ask that you tell us who you are. So if you're a student or faculty or community guest, tell us who you are, and then just ask away. So we'll go ahead and get started. And a number of things came up today that we said, we'll sort of talk about later. So I have a number of those things on the agenda as well. A couple of things that came up today as we talked about books, as we talked about new media, and how to convey science, and we've talked about using entertainment programming. And I wanted the panel to sort of discuss their opinions about some recent statistics here in the U.S. that came out that said 1% of our fourth graders and only 2% of our eighth graders performed at what's considered an advanced level on science tests. And we hinted at science literacy in the general population and how that's measured, but these are tests of basic science in fourth and eighth graders that if you have children, you know how that takes place. 1% of our fourth graders and only 2% of our eighth graders performed at what's called an advanced level here in the United States. And so, the U.S. is 48th out of 133 nations in terms of K-12 math and science education. So we have all these things, these wonderful things we've been talking about today, and we've talked about reading and the importance of reading and literacy and new media. And I would just like to hear, sort of your opinions about the state of our K-12, in particular, science education, and what is it we need to be doing here? Because that's, at least in my opinion, a bit abysmal. So, Bruce.
Yeah, so a couple things. One is, yes, those numbers are real. They come from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They're also stable. They've been at that level for a long time. Minor variations, but before we get too crisis-laden, if it's a crisis, it's a stable, long-term crisis. It's not as though something's suddenly going wrong. But the other thing for us to think that those numbers point to is for us to be thinking of education not just as what happens in the formal schooling system, but what happens in the informal environments, in the planetarium that we just came from, or in science museums, or in the media stories, whether we're talking about the blogging or the traditional media or tweets or whatever, which is to say there's substantial evidence that a lot of people learn their science through these informal media. And there's evidence to show that the informal, what are called informal environments, may be more effective, particularly for reaching diverse audiences. The people who don't fit all that well, don't do so well in the formal schooling system, they use the informal system, and they can really dramatically increase their knowledge of how to kill mosquitoes.
Deep free.
Just do not let a mosquito free in front of an infectious disease person. You're now going to be completely obsessed by this mosquito. It's taunting.
So I want to highlight the importance of the informal environment.
Janet, you also had a comment.
Two things come to mind. First of all is I think that we don't value or appreciate science and their practitioners nearly enough in this country. We venerate athletes and celebrities and musicians, and scientists and engineers should be rock stars too. And it's a matter of what, adults, set as value systems for kids. And, you can't blame the kids if they're taking
Right.
lessons from, the greater society as a whole. So we need to, I think, transform how we respect people who do science and engineering. Second of all, I am the administrator of, in my many hats, Science News for Kids, which is a website for science for middle schoolers. And it's something I've been really passionate about for a long time, ever since I think she was 10 at the time, 10-year-old brought some friends home, and she explained that I was a science writer, and they said, where does she find anything to write about? Isn't everything that's known about science in books? And it's like, whoa, where did they come up with that? And so it's been a mission ever since then for me to make sure that through Science News for Kids, they learn that science is a living enterprise, that almost nothing is known about science. It just barely scratches the surface. And we try and show the process and the excitement and all of that. We've also learned that kids don't like to learn about science from other kids. They want to learn about it from adults because they think of themselves as a little adult and they want to be sort of peer. So we try and get them involved, but I think there needs to be more things like that. And we present, news, science news and feature news every week for kids, for our middle school audience. The last slide I had up showed our Science News for Kids website, and the featured story there from 2 weeks ago was on epigenetics. So it's epigenetics for middle schoolers. And I don't know anyone else who has attacked that yet, but I thought it was really important. And I got a geneticist to write the story for our kids to let them know, instead of, all of your traits being in your genes, a lot of them are on your genes. And, did, I think, a really great job. But that, to my mind, is what I'm trying to do. We have scientific, ideas and processes that are maybe only 3 to 5 years old, in the greater understanding, and they're on our website right now. And I think that that's catalyzing a lot of interest. We're getting hits from over 130 countries, I think, on the website. So I want them to know it's a living thing, the stuff is changing, and that all of this stuff is cool and accessible, for the most part, accessible for middle schoolers. The one thing we don't seem to be able to get across to them is disease. These kids are, they're going to live forever, just ask them. And so they're not interested in chronic disease and, the stuff that happens to old farts. They just, But I'm finding that I think we can sell a lot of medicine through physiology, how the body works, the mechanisms. And they seem to really be taking that. But
Miriam, what were you going to?
Well, I should have gone in between the two of you. I always agree with you. But I actually want to continue what Bruce had said about looking at who we're talking about. And if you take those NAEP, the progress reports of our country, fourth graders are the black hole of American education. And there's a reason. And this is where the reading brain has something to tell us. Well, but first, if you take that figure that they ask about children in fourth grade reading fluency, it's 37% of our kids are not reading proficiently in fourth grade. This is the United States, 37%. Then the real story is when you unpack it, and that's your other point. 61% of African American kids, 54% of Latino kids, 26% of European Americans. This is an outrage. This is an outrage. Fourth grade should not be what is really the whole. So if you lose the kids at third grade, it's the story, I hate to say this, because we're a country of second and third and fourth and fifth chances. But the reality is that fourth grade is horrible if you haven't become proficient and fluent because of the material, then change it. They used to always say, you learn to read so you can read to learn. And that's the watershed. So this fourth grade place is really, really awful. But the other thing you said that was so interesting to me is, how do we make it exciting? And I don't know if you read all the things that Steve Jobs said last week. A lot of commentaries were made. But there was one thing that was so it just struck a chord in me. He said he almost didn't make it because he was he always was somebody who thought outside the box. But he said in the 4th grade, he had Mrs. Hill. And Mrs. Hill looked at him. He was failing. Steve Jobs was failing. And she said, let's do it another way. And that's really what you're both saying. How do we do science in a different way, especially for kids who aren't learning in traditional ways, whether it's science or, I mean, one of the things that I actually taught 4th grade in a Peace Corps-like mission, and I won't tell you where, well, I will tell you, I have to tell you, because it was Hawaii. Doesn't sound like, you know, I mean, well, you get no political cliche, you teach in Hawaii, none. Anyway, so.
With Obama? With Obama? You
Well,
teach
maybe
from
with
Hawaii.
Obama, it's pre-Obama. But anyway, my 4th graders so many of them couldn't read. And science, you forget it. But what we did, we went and studied volcanoes. We made the first trip off their island to the big island, and we were there. Everything we really know is right. You make it come to life. And somehow we have to make science heroes, but we also have to make it come to life for the kids. And for some kids like Steve Jobs, it's not doing what's in the textbook. It's letting them do their own experiments. It's them creating. She really let him be an autodidact in the 4th grade, or he wouldn't have been who he was today. He credits her for being the person he was. Let us all be Mrs. Hills, whatever age.
Which, with the constraints in our, at least public school system, is very, I don't know if we still have any public school teachers here, but, we talk about teaching to the test. And
Yeah, it's absolutely, yeah.
But I think that that's interesting. There would be a group of students of a particular age that could name a scientist. They could name Beekman, or at least an interest in science. And that made it exciting, whereas today, Jim, you were talking about this earlier, you have to compete with Rick Pitino. And in town, in Louisville, that's a very difficult competition. So when you ask people to name, 5, superstars or whatever, not a single one of them are scientists. They're athletes and,
When in a national survey that I think was the Adler Planetarium did a couple of years ago, asking people to name living scientists, that was the question. Name living scientists. The answers were Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, and Bill Gates.
Well, I don't know, but I find those sorts of questions that I don't think those really reflect much of anything because science doesn't work the way it did in the age of Louis Pasteur or Thomas Edison. We have like this one person who could just just change everything. Science works in big networks now, and so I don't think that's so important now. And then actually, I think rather than kids being able to name a scientist, you could have kids do science, and there are some nice opportunities now, some of which are actually made possible by the internet. So there are lots of citizen science projects, which are where you do real stuff. You can track firefly populations and be part of a nationwide experiment, or you can there's some tools like if the motivation is there and it's not really that expensive, kids can spend the summer digging up dirt and finding totally new viruses using metagenomics. It's not that expensive anymore. So, or these robot competitions, like Dean Kamen has set up this incredible robot competition. They rent out a Superdome for this. So there are definitely ways that kids can be doing science. I don't think a sort of hero worship of science matters at all.
Yeah.
Let's see a question back there.
One second. Yeah.
Caught my attention is why aren't we producing the Lewis pastures? Why did we say it's 100 years back and not
Because
now?
science works totally differently now.
But why can't we replicate that?
Because all that low-hanging fruit's been picked. And science, the only way anyone's going to find, the Higgs boson is if 1,000 PhDs get together and work really hard and maybe find a little blip that may or may not be the Higgs boson. And, there's not going to be a Louis Pasteur among them. It's going to be a collaborative effort. It's the same with, genome projects, the same with ecology projects. In my own science writing, I actually find sometimes I have to kind of, my editors always want you to be writing about the Louis Pasteur, the maverick who changed everything single-handedly. And I keep saying, they don't exist. That's not the story. But it's just that just isn't it.
Just someone has to see something different, and that changes it.
Jenna, what
No,
would
I
you
just
add?
don't agree.
Well, what I was going to say is there are also some moves in that direction. And my organization puts on a competition for middle school kids, and the kids get into the competition on the basis of a science fair project. But once they arrive in Washington, that project doesn't count much anymore. They get put together in groups, and they get judged on how the group does. And if some kid dominates in the group, the judges basically tell them to back off, because they're trying to teach them that science is a collaborative thing. And I think if we start taking that, not just from this, elite competition in Washington, but get that word down to the classroom, you pull the weaker kids up and let them know they can be part of the process, even if they can't be the team leader. And so I think that you're absolutely right. The move is to get a group thing, and the idea is maybe some kid could be a lab tech instead of, a PI. But the idea is that it really is going to have to be more of a
And those
collaborative
robot
thing.
competitions, they're done by
Oh, yeah.
teams. where you get it.
Sort of a comment in supporting what you said is, I question if science was ever done the way that it's, typically told in history. I mean, in hindsight, someone sort of picked out of the crowd and put it on a pedestal. That's not to say they didn't make great contributions or anything, but usually it's part of some continuum. People talk about Einstein, but there are a lot of people who did a lot of the things that Einstein was talking about, and he was someone who put it together and was heralded. Well, once again, he was a great guy and all, but I think it's
Yeah, I think we have to be a little more careful about that. I think that it's very clear that there are many instances in which you've got progress being made because of groups of people working together. There are a lot of problems like the ones you mentioned. But I think we have to be careful when we say that there aren't any people who are going to be recognized in the future in the same way, because sometimes takes a while to recognize that. It'll maybe take 3 or 4 decades. And so we can go back to Einstein, and Einstein really was unique. I mean, but he was embedded in a network. All science is embedded in a network. Nobody can argue about that, as was Pasteur's and Darwin's. But we certainly recognize that there were these minds that made these big advances, and I would say deserve to be referred to as heroes. And so we can go each decade. I mean, you and I are very familiar with evolution, and we would say Darwin clearly was one, but I would certainly say Hamilton and Williams were 2 others who really kind of worked independently, and they were great figures. Maybe number 2 and number 3 after Darwin. Now they're both dead, right? And it's easier to look back and say, wow, our understanding of evolution was dramatically changed by those 2 people. The inclusive fitness ideas, although people modify it, and then also by the levels of selection. Yeah. So I think we probably have both. I just think it might take us another 10, 20 years to figure out who really made a central conceptual advance. It was embedded in science, but still could be recognized as sort of a hero of this decade, let's say, or last decade.
So one of the things I think that the idea that I think we're talking about here is partly a sort of historical question about how does science advance. But it's partly a question of how do we tell the stories in ways that will be inspiring. And so that's, I think, part of what Carl was saying is, he finds the best way to do it is to tell the story of the science itself and not to try to find that heroic person to tell the story of. One of the ways we can think about it are other kinds of, if not heroic, but nonetheless exemplary kinds of abilities. So we have a local story so I live in Ithaca, New York, upstate New York. We're at the very bottom of one of the Finger Lakes in central New York. About 2 months ago, a kid, high school or middle school, I can't remember, I think she's high school, on a floating classroom. This is one of these things, they take a bunch of kids out on a boat, they dip nets in the water, they find what they get, and they teach them something about ecology and slime and whatever else. And she happened to look at this one thing that came up in the net and say to the cruise leader, this one doesn't look like all the other ones we're finding. And it turned out to be an invasive weed called Hydrilla, which has moved from Florida up there, but which has never yet been found in the Great Lakes or waters leading to the Great Lakes. And it was found in Ithaca, not in the lake, but in the inlet to the lake. And the biology of this, of Hydrilla, is that it reproduces in the late fall, or early, it reproduces right about now, and spreads they're called turions, reproductive buds. And so if you could get rid of it before the turions spread, you could potentially stop this invasive, this is one of the worst invasive species in the country. Florida spends $30 million a year mowing paths through Hydrilla. You could potentially stop it from getting into the Great Lakes system. That high school kid deserves recognition, right? For having spotted that something was different. It was the first step in a big chain. She wasn't involved in the rest of the chain of what's been happening. It's a much longer story than I'll tell, but I won't. But I think that's one of the things is how can you tell inspiring stories, whether it's in the media or in a museum exhibit or in a website.
Did she get her story told?
You know, this is the thing, I don't think she has. I think, you know, those of us, I've ended up being involved in the periphery of some of the attempts to deal with this. And I realized that I knew about her, but I didn't know her name. But actually, on Monday, what day was this? On Wednesday, on Tuesday of this week, they applied the herbicide. This involved closing the inlet. Right? No boats are allowed in the inlet. This is a waterway. It's beautiful weather. We had gorgeous weather last weekend. The city had declared an environmental emergency. The sheriff was patrolling to prevent people from putting boats in the water and so on. So on Wednesday, I was telling the story to my class, and I realized I don't know the girl's name. I wanted to put a picture of her up, and I, who've been involved, don't know. So no, she has not yet had her story told.
Maybe wait until the voters stop being.
We have a good after. It's not worth it.
I wanted to throw out just something from my perspective. What I think about a lot is Marcel Duchamp, who's a chess player and an artist in that order, I suppose. And the way that Duchamp changed the way that we look at the world. And did it take Duchamp to do that? You know, did it take Duchamp to take the toilet or the urinal and to sign it and say this is art, and to change the way we looked at objects and everything, the way we see? Would it have been someone else who had done that? If John Cage hadn't done the 120 minutes of silence with the piano or whatever the hell it was, he changed the way we hear. We haven't listened the same way since Cage did that. And would have someone else have done that? Or would someone else have done it in the same way or a different way? How did they get there? What took them to that place? How much are they products of the zeitgeist and how much are they, accidents? Those are things I wonder about a lot because I want to lionize them, Oh, Duchamp, he's the father of us all, or, Picasso and those guys always said, Cézanne, he's the father of us all. Do we really need to have these lionized figures, and what does that do for us? And are they accidents or whatever? Beekman, recognizable, that's great. Beekman doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. People call me Beekman, I'm like, I'm the guy who plays Beekman. Beekman doesn't exist. It's a Disneyfication of society to get people to believe in bullshit, It's like, no. And I refuse to cop to it. I'm like, no, Beekman doesn't exist. I'm not going to play that game. So anyway, it's sort of a random bunch of ranting about what does it mean to lionize and what's the point of this and how does it happen?
Yeah, I think that there's one way to look at science and how it's done, and you're looking for the Pasteurs and the Einsteins. I'd rather see more of a democratization of science. Anybody can be a scientist. Anybody can take the the way of looking at the world that a scientist takes. Now, whether that's how you make your living or not doesn't make any difference. The fact that any of us can approach the world that way, that we should maybe at some level approach the world that way, means that anybody can try it, and that girl, that young person, can have the opportunity to make a major impact based on her observation. If she'd been told, well, you're a girl, you can't do science, or you have to be, Madame Curie, or you have to be Einstein to do science, then maybe she never would have even noticed that.
But that's not the reason to lionize science. I mean, I think that it helps to have role models.
You mean scientists?
Yes. You need role models, and there are too few scientists and engineers are held up as role models. And as a result, nobody wants to try and do science or emulate them or look for science in their own backyard because they don't see it as something that's interesting and a way to, become special.
I agree, but I would turn that around because the way that we do history in this country, I don't know how it's done in other countries, but the way that we do history in this country is to create mythological figures. Columbus did this, and Helen Keller did that. How much do you know about Helen Keller after she learned to read and write? Or not, speak, or whatever it is that we know about.
What do you even know
Not
about?
much. Speak, whatever. But how much do you know about her after that great mythological thing that she did? I mean, how many of you know that she was a socialist? That she wrote that after graduating from Radcliffe, thank you. From Radcliffe, she went on to write about labor and stuff like that. You don't know about it because that's not part of the myth. The Civil Rights Movement. How much do you know about the individuals that really cause changes in our civil rights perspective? What you read in the textbook in high school is, well, Congress made a law to change it. Now talk about how unempowering that is, to think that those big guys up there, they can make things better. How about if every one of us can do science, and we should be thinking about it that way, and any one of us can do great things because that's the nature of science.
But it's still
But we still need more.
It's not either or.
No.
This is operational dangerous. And back in the caveman and cavewoman days, when the caveman would go out there and slay some beast, and maybe it was the record beast slayer, and then he dies one time, and then for generations after, there's stories told around the campfire about this. I mean, this is telling stories, and that's what journalists do. We tell stories. We tell stories about people, and there may be faults with the way we do that, and it may sometimes get simplified, and now with Twitter it's going to get even more simplified because they only have 140 characters. But I think it's human nature to tell stories and to hold people up. And then it's also human nature to have other people come back and say, wait a minute, what about this person?
Great, here, can I have her input? You've been waiting patiently a long time.
Thank you. It seems to me that there's a really natural interface between the masses and artists and athletes. There doesn't seem to be one with scientists. I mean, you kids dream of being Eric Clapton or Kobe Bryant because they see them, and there's ways for them to interact with them on an imaginative level where there doesn't seem to be with scientists and doing science. And I wonder how much you guys think, to some extent, this chasm that exists between science and scientists and the rest of us is about how scientists interact with the rest of us, and what responsibility if any of you are scientists, I'm sorry I didn't meet you before, how much responsibility do you have to change that, and how could you? Do you see what I mean?
So I'm not a scientist nor a journalist. I study someone who studies public understanding of science, where the buzzwords in the field are public engagement. And there are various activities involved in public engagement, some of which are deliberately intended to humanize scientists. So the one I'm particularly thinking of as you're talking is something called a science cafe, where it would be more or less what we're doing. It would have been more or less what we're doing. Is there one here? Great, good, glad to hear. Would have been more or less what we're doing today, except there would have actually been more comfortable seating and sitting around and drinks and food and beer. In Ithaca, we call ours the Science Cabaret.
In Atlanta, it's the Science Tavern.
So in Australia, it's Science in the Pub. anyway, part of this is about having scientists up there engaging and maybe giving a talk, but giving it in a way that also shows that they are humans and that they can they put their pants on one leg at a time, and so on. And so to try to reduce some of that distance, sometimes physically, so that in fact we would not be sitting behind a table 15 feet from you.
I didn't set this up.
But that particularly this kind of space is not conducive to the notion that we're all going to interact in some kind of way. And so there are these tools that you can try to use, and that scientists, by being committed to participate in these things, some of those things are different than the storytelling approaches. Right? The storytelling approaches are, even in the short 140 character versions, are more planned or more deliberate in certain ways.
I think what you were, as you were asking your question, I was thinking about Carl Sagan. You know, I mean, we haven't had a scientist that had the same rapport, you know, really since Sagan. I mean, they're just, you know, can you name, I mean, maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson. I mean, that's about the only one. And we don't have scientists that are personable, you know, like, and there haven't been that many.
That's why Baroness Greenfield gets a lot of press, because she
Right.
has that connection with the public.
Yeah, doctors. Dr. Oz.
Dr. Yeah, well,
And that's a problem.
right. And sometimes with technology, and I know some researchers make a big distinction between science and technology, and a very big, you know, we do have the Steve Jobs, you know, phenomenon kind of
Wasn't
thing.
Carl Sagan really attacked for his high profile?
Yes.
Was that didn't many
Yes.
scientists?
He was by scientists.
Yes.
Yeah, oh,
His circle.
yeah, yes, very much so.
We do have other people who are filling, like Dave Attenborough is somebody who's filled out financial
Yeah.
history. I mean, he wasn't technically trained as a scientist, but certainly he had a tremendous amount of scientific knowledge about natural history.
Right. Although, I don't know if he had quite the same
Probably not, but still,
rapport.
you know.
It was
Well,
better,
they're in the
definitely.
same ballpark.
Yeah, definitely. There was, yeah,
Just a comment too, I no one's brought it up, but I was raised in the era of Sputnik. And certainly, we didn't have all this, you know, camaraderie with scientists or closeness, and yet, because there was this big national goal, I mean, scientists, it was an era when scientists were looked up to, and yet I can't name a single one. I doubt any of us could at the time, other than God help me, Werner von Braun. But remember that song by Tom? But I guess we don't even have, I guess it was because, and then it came to storytelling in Apollo 13, right? But that was decades later. So we had this, I mean, I looked up to scientists in part because of that cachet given to, you know, the space race. And it was a national goal. And I guess we don't have that, to the extent that a national goal might give science a cachet, and I'm saying all these other ways are.
But that raises a question about what do we want people to know about science? We want people to know the exciting, really interesting intellectual questions that are there, whether it's in science or technology. I mean, these are part of what motivates especially a lot of science writers is this is neat stuff, right? You know, we heard that. We heard a bunch of passion today from people about this is neat stuff. But that issue of the Sputnik and the national goal, it's a political issue. In fact, that one was very much a military issue. We now know much more clearly that Sputnik, that the space race was a military race, cloaked in this sort of let's go to the moon kind of goal, but it was very much driven by Cold War politics. Now, to me, as a historian of science, that's fascinating. I actually find it more fascinating than microbes and infectious diseases. I like those stuff, but you know, that part of how science has advanced has been because of its interweaving with other kinds of social issues, and that, to me, those are the fascinating stories. Now, how much it's harder to tell. There are far fewer people who get excited by those stories than by the infectious disease stories.
See, that's education. I mean, that's how we got more science in the classroom, more math in the classroom, and
That was a panicky response, and I don't think that's how we want to advance science today.
No, but I'm just commenting on it historically, though, that it did in its time bring the public's attention towards science, even if it was not for, the gold standard, but the space race.
The thing that I want to raise here, and I'm about to get myself in trouble because I do not have children, but when you talk about the space race, the thing that I reflect on is how much child raising and what children are able to do as a sort of educating themselves, how much that has changed since the 50s and 60s. My husband's an avionics engineer. He was born in 1953, so what, 4 years after Sputnik?
Before Sputnik.
When was Sputnik?
57.
57,
2
okay,
weeks after.
sorry. So when he talks about his childhood, what he talks about is blowing things up in the backyard. So that was partly just being a boy, but it was also being allowed to do, to do science himself. I mean, when I was a kid growing up in England, when we learned about the Stone Age in school, they actually took us out on the grounds of the school and helped us find flints and taught us how to chip them, so that we understood, what that. I'm very bad on human history, sorry, so I'm not going to get myself in trouble by talking about different episodes, epochs. But now a kid you can't even buy for a child a home chemistry kit that actually has any chemicals in it.
Right, because it's too dangerous.
That's too dangerous.
So, when I hear Bruce talk about the sort of non-classroom settings, alternate settings in which kids can learn about science and experiment with science, I wonder how much we have taken those away and kept kids from being natural scientists.
Yes, you were next. Yes, you've been waiting patiently.
All right. So you can talk about public engagement and different ways to bridge the gaps between what happens in the lab and what happens. It was mentioned that what happens in the lab, or it seems like it's behind closed doors or in an ivory tower compared to anything that the public at large would be aware of. And I was wondering if any of you familiar, I guess, with the bio blitzes that E.O. Wilson, I think it was, encourages. And so that's sort of public engagement for ecology and finding all that stuff, but also the computer program Foldit, which is a game based on protein folding and stuff like that. I'm not familiar enough with the science to know how dramatic of a breakthrough that is, but different ways that, for example, and I guess both of them are crowdsourcing research. And that's ways that even using the internet, using these new devices, could actually draw the public into the actual act of doing the scientific research and getting publications out there and making discoveries. And so it's the future of that, to bring the public in, does that hold, is it a flash in the pan, or the help traction actually draw people in and bridge that gap?
I think it could have huge impacts, and it ties into what I was saying before with citizen science. So Foldit, basically the story of Foldit is that protein folding is a very hard problem. You can't just sort of take a string of amino acids and figure out how the protein is going to fold, just from first principles. And so, scientists come up with these very sophisticated computer programs that do a so-so job, but they take a lot of time to sort of crunch through all the possible solutions. It's just a vast number of possible solutions. And so what some scientists did was they said, all right, well, let's just take advantage of people's sleeping computers and just, put a little piece of software, you can download a piece of software and we can use your computer to help solve this using this computer program. And they thought, well, to make it fun, we'll just show, it'll be like the screensaver, it's showing the protein, the computer trying to these different configurations. So you can just kind of watch it feel like. And somebody emailed to these people at the University of Washington and said, this is driving me nuts, because I'm looking at this and I can see where it should go, and the computer can't figure it out. Is there any way that I could just push it in? And they said, yes, absolutely. And so they wrote some software where you can kind of help the computer along. And then they were like, well, let's make it a game. And let's give, who will have the high score of the day, in the month, the number of the little parts of it solved. And so I think it was last year, the Foldit, they got their first really good result. And folder. They solved a protein that people were banging their heads on for years, and they published it in Nature. And this was a paper that had 57,000 co-authors.
Wow.
And then they just published another one a couple of weeks ago, solving an HIV protein and cracking that. And, they have an even bigger group of people playing around with it. So, just
So,
creative uses.
I'm going to give another positive example, but which gives raises some of these institutional problems. So a similar project is called Zooniverse, in which basically lots of astronomical data comes down showing with photographs of galaxies. Turns out computers are terrible at classifying galaxies. The pattern matching doesn't work. So you need to have humans look at these things. So they designed essentially a game, essentially a memory kind of, if you remember memory when you were kids, kind of game where you do pattern matching. And so they've gone through tens of thousands of images. And at one point, and there was a discussion board alongside of it, so people who were participating could be talking about it. And at one point, there was a teacher in
Holland.
Who said, there's this one set I keep coming up across that doesn't work. Doesn't fit any of these patterns, standardized patterns you see. And has anybody else been finding them? And the answer was yes. And so there is now actually a new category that's been published, and it's a new category of galaxy called P-shaped galaxies. The problem was the question of who gets credit. It wasn't clear that you were going to publish this with 57,000 people. There were significant numbers of members of the team that had set this up that felt that the workers should get, all of the public that was involved should get credit for helping, for being the technicians, but should not actually be the co-authors because they had not made the discovery. And there's a lot of tension within the astronomical community about how do you handle this question of crowdsourcing and who gets credit, because in the day-to-day life of science, credit matters. It's how you get promoted, it's how your salary gets determined, it helps whether you get grants. And so these things there's these institutional forces that shape our ability to move to some of this crowdsourcing.
But I think that's going to be an issue throughout science, even if you aren't talking about quote-unquote amateurs. I mean, more and more science is done where you go into a database that's been created by lots of people, GenBank or something like that, and you go in and you look for patterns. Look, I found this interesting pattern in the evolution of these genes. You had that insight, but it was made possible by the collective work of thousands of other people. And that's going to be more and more of an issue. Michael Nielsen has a new book out, whose name I'm blanking on. Princeton University. That's just about this issue of how science is changing in these ways. And so I think it's just going to be very different from what we're used to. Scientists will need to get used to it.
I wanted to go back to the space race thing. A tangent from that is, that cost a lot of money to do that. And so the public had to be convinced that it was worth it. And one of the big communication issues I think we have now is, in a time of limited resources, how do we justify the money we spend? And when I see, blog comments after a story on science, a lot of them are, we're spending money on this, my tax money went for that, because you can also really simplify things to the point where it sounds ridiculous. Why am I paying to study frog sex? Or, something like that. And it might be a really interesting question that is going to have implications for us, but I think that's an important communication skill that we all need to have. I mean, we have to do it when we ask grants. We have to convince some panel somewhere that it's significant. But that's a different type of communication. We can't use the same argument when we're talking to the general public about why we want the tax dollars.
I'm always amazed. I teach one of the things I teach at Yale is a workshop for science graduate students. And it's pretty short, so I just deal with some of the basics. And one thing that I find effective but a bit sobering for them is I'll just pick somebody out random and just say, okay, tell me what you do. And it's the most horrific scene of torture you can imagine. Because I'm like, don't give me any jargon. Tell me what you do, and tell me in a way, that lets me understand why you care about it. And what's amazing to me is like that for some reason, I've had the good fortune of picking at random people who do work that really is amazing stuff. So the contrast between what they're really doing and the terrible job they're doing of just telling me in a few sentences what they do is amazing. It's a big problem scientists have.
I just have to add to that. Do you come to Science Online?
Yeah.
So so there's a crowd. Well, there's a conference that's grown up over the past 4 or 5 years that takes place in the Triangle in North Carolina called Science Online, which is a sort of crowdsourced unconference where a lot of people who blog and write about science come together. And one of the proposals for this year is perfecting your elevator speech for scientists.
It's important.
And we talk about public engagement with science, and as the scientist who's studying frog sex, which could have real implications, but how do you justify that to a group of 4th graders who can't understand it, and now they're in high school and they're worrying about money and everything else. That's a lot of what the science community has to figure out how to do, and maybe the communication community has to figure out how to facilitate. And now all the biologists and chemists in the room, you could hire me for quite a consulting fee.
I'm just curious as to whether, to what extent that is a divide in communication between basic science and applied science, and whether you think there's a perceptual difference in how you communicate, or we tend to be, Americans are pragmatic people, and appreciate applied, presumably. But the curiosity of science that really extends the boundaries, that makes the leaps, the basic science really does, and the applied makes, I would think, more incremental change. Do you think there's a gap in the American public in appreciating those two, and do you communicate those things? Do you always have to sit there and justify it? I mean, in applied ways?
No, I didn't say to justify it in an applied way. Just tell us what you do, and a lot of the time that basic stuff will just captivate people's imagination. And someone did a study. They took data from the New York Times, the University of Pennsylvania study, and they said, okay, what are the stories that people email and read the most, and so on. Let's sort of score the certain qualities that they have. And the thing that came out on top was stories that made you think about the world in a different way, like inspire a certain sense of awe. And a lot of those were science stories, basic science stories, not news stories. Those don't get people jazzed up. They just don't. So I, my editor came to me and said, "You want to write a story about slime balls?" I mean, that's the kind of work situation I have. It's a good thing. And I'm very grateful for that. So he said, "Slime balls." I'm like, "Yes, I've been interested in them for a long time." I write the piece, and for 2 or 3 days, it was the most emailed story in the whole New York Times site. And that happens again and again. That people really do like this. They're fascinated by basic science, basic physics, and so on. You don't have to this whole I have to justify it because someday we'll make Tang out of this. It's a waste of time. And you're in a way you're sort of underestimating everyone's capacity for wonder. So there are 2 pieces of journalism about that that I wanted to ask. One is, if the slime mold story had appeared on Yahoo News as opposed to the New York Times News, would it have been as widely circulated? Would it have been as much at the top of the list? So one of the things I want us to think about is different kinds of audiences, demographically and educational-wise. But the other one is the question of, again, a lot of what you talk about is writing about these really fascinating aspects of science. But both Janet and Maren during the day talked about, and I think
him to a certain extent as well, their concerns about the changes in journalism that affect the investigative aspect of journalism. The part of journalism which is, yeah, I know you think that's important, but quite frankly, aren't you just a careerist and trying to get money? Really, maybe this isn't where we should be putting them. Or, by the way, and how much are you cheating on your data? How much are you in, is it affecting air pollution or environmental issues? That is, there's another aspect of, especially the journalism piece of what we're talking about, that isn't about convincing people that science is good and necessary and a wonderful thing, which most of us in this room believe. Maybe all of us in this room believe. But nonetheless is another one of those functions that has to be played. How do we mix those things?
Well, this may not be a direct answer, but I mean, just like lately, for those who live around there, I've been asking a lot of questions about how our metropolitan sewer district spends its money. I think, scientists that get public money need to be able to have an answer for why it's worth, somehow they have to be able to come up with something that, even when it's basic science, they have to be able to have an articulate argument that the general public is going to understand, or otherwise they'll have, like John McCain did a few years ago, talking about his grizzly bear DNA research that coming from Montana, I actually know that people who live in Montana want to have knowledge about the grizzly bears and what's going on, because they might come, eat their pets, or maybe their uncle comes out to visit. So I don't know. I think that everybody, especially in a time of tight money, everybody has to justify their existence, unfortunately.
I just responded. But I think we make a mistake in thinking in that justification in narrow terms. Comes back to what Carl was saying. To some extent, people will value things if something provides a benefit in some standard area of practical good. But I think this idea of expanding your understanding of things, learning about something you'd never heard of before, the sense of wonder you're talking about, that's something that people actually, you don't have to convince them of that if it's done right, because they'll say, wow, that's great. That's the justification, is that you've learned something you didn't know of before. That's, I think, where the connection between the scientists and the public becomes terribly important. I mean, everybody's going to say, yeah, if I could avoid lung cancer by having less pollution, that's a practical benefit. But also, you don't have to if you just have the title of the grant, right, they'll say, oh, what are we wasting our time on sex lives of amphibians? But if you actually tell the story, people say, wow, that is really amazing. And that's considered by people a practical benefit. If you can get them, if you can tap into that sense of wonder, you can stimulate that. And that is what scientists do, which is scientists aren't very good at.
But it's harder to do on 100, 300, and 500 word stories, and increasingly that's what we're forced to do. When you're given 1,000 to 2,000 words on a sexy topic, and frankly, I think slime mold is a very sexy topic. I know, I agree with you, but oftentimes we end up having to write about something that's important and not very sexy at all. And we still have to do it in 200 or 400 or 600 words, which is remarkably little, and multiple sources. So you've got multiple affiliations and, all subtracting down on your thing. And you still have to do, and it's harder to make, to tell a story. You try your best.
And do it in 3 hours.
Yeah, well, that's even worse. But it's a really challenging thing to do. So you can't expect much journalism to do that. What he was describing is some of what we all aim for in a sort of primo, but what is sort of your basic, everyday journalism doesn't do that, doesn't have that option. And we still have to somehow let the public see why things are important. So sometimes you're going to grab them with a statistic or a dollar value or a killer quote, of malfeasance or something else, but you're going to do something, you've got to find a hook to make them care about this. But it's often not going to be a great, sexy story, because stories take space.
I want to hear Carl's address of the Yahoo versus New York Times issue, because I think that's a really interesting aspect that we haven't really talked about. I mean, you have to admit the New York Times has a certain readership, and Yahoo probably has a different readership.
A lot of this, okay, but a lot of the, I haven't looked at the statistics on science stories on Yahoo. That would be an interesting exercise. Certainly Yahoo has plenty of science coverage. They do, and that's just a fact. You know, and Yahoo is, this will be interesting. I mean, Yahoo has actually been hiring a lot of journalists from kind of traditional newspapers and so on for finance and for sports and so on. So it'll be interesting to see if they maybe they'll decide to go into science as well. I don't know. But I don't know. It's not to toot the New York Times' horn too much, but I mean, if you look at their print readership and their website, I mean, you're talking tens of millions of people. So, yes, it's not a random sample, but it's a big number, and they have lots of other things within the New York Times to choose from. So I don't know. I still think that speaks to something. So here's a couple other things. So a few weeks ago, #1 movie at the box office was Contagion. Going up against all sorts of other kinds of movies. Another thing to consider, to think about, to look at in I think it'll be 2012. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, we're talking about, is going to do a remake of Cosmos. And it's going to be on Fox. So let's watch how that experiment goes.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm almost speechless.
I just had a question. I mean, right now, especially in tough economic times, and you think of people's needs, and they're not going to be thinking about the esoteric stuff like what, they think of as basic science, as a lot of it is fairly esoteric to most people. How do you convince them that this is what needs to be researched when their basic needs are not being met? Some people, are barely holding on to a job. Some people are in debt up to their ears. How do you convince them that it's worth spending money on this versus, say, the Women, Infants, and Children's Food Program or various other programs that help some of these people that are in these positions? How do you communicate that basic science is still needed even in this environment?
There's not one of us that wants to tackle that.
I will. I don't think it's our job to do that.
Exactly.
That's your job. Our job is to explain interesting science. If you can't explain why it's compelling to me, I'm not going to do it for you. So, that really isn't my job. My job is to explain sort of new ideas and events and not to justify anything. I don't have a vested interest in that. I shouldn't going into a story. And so my job is not out there to do that, or I think, those of us up here. But it may well be your job to justify why it's, you should get a grant. And if you can do a compelling job there, we may be similarly, compelled to include that in a story, that line, attributable to you.
It's a bad thing for journalists to think that way. It gets us into trouble as journalists. So, and just as an example, in my own experience, NASA made a big deal last year about a paper that claimed that bacteria could live on arsenic, and it kind of smelled like they were saying, like, oh boy, I hope we don't get cut. Let's show how the magnificent stuff we're doing. Now, if I was, had that sort of mindset, I'd be like, well, gee, how can I help NASA keep its budget going and blah, blah, blah. When in reality, the reality that needed reporting was that there were a whole bunch of experts who thought that this stuff wasn't any good. People were literally saying, this paper shouldn't have been published. So, I wrote this, I wrote a story to that effect on Slate, and I was told by people from NASA, like, oh, there aren't many people at NASA who like you right now. Like, I should care. It's ridiculous. Like we're all supposed to be, propping up the astrobiology budget at NASA. No, that's not what we're doing, and if we try to do that, then we're not being journalists anymore.
Period.
I'd like to answer it from a different perspective. I think it isn't the job of journalists, but I think it is the job of some of us in academic life. I think, in fact, more of us should take on that role. And I'm not going to speak to anyone out here in particular, but I've just had some of the most fascinating conversations over the last 24 hours, including with you, Paul. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how do we get these messages out? And I'm just going to tell you a question I was asked at NICHD, the NIH Child Health and Human Development. So a few years ago, Reed Lyon, someone who's, well, perhaps some of you know, was the chief officer of Child Health then, said, brought all of us who've gotten these big grants, and he brought us in this room, and he pointed his finger like this. He said, how many of you have written a single article for the public press? I'm like, oh. And, you know, almost none of us had. None of us wrote editorials. None of us wrote letters to the editor when we were protesting. And it really got to me. And he said, we all in academic life, and we're a captive audience in Carroll, we have a responsibility to the public as well. And so maybe you don't have that, but I personally feel there is a translational aspect to us who work and who talk to the public and who should write more for the public.
But how much of that, though, is driven by the administration of your universities, who put all of the emphasis on getting into peer-reviewed journals, and they don't really give the professors much credit for getting in
You
popular
cannot
press.
be more accurate about the life of a pre-tenured professor.
That's right.
But post-tenure, I really believe that there is a certain mantle of societal responsibility that we have the luxury of putting around our shoulders.
And the funding agencies are now requiring it. It's called the dissemination plan.
Absolutely.
Now you are required to put it in your grant application, your
NSF.
dissemination plan.
NSF, you just,
So you know, but you're exactly right. Pre-tenure, you're just thinking about the peer review, but post-tenure, you're thinking about the dissemination plan.
I mean, she kind of was leading to what I was going to say, but I think all of you do a wonderful job, but we have to rely on, not on the media, we have to rely on each other to teach each other. With kids, you put the media, like, okay, this is going to teach you, but in watching TV is like a passive learning. It's not, you're not really teaching the kid how it's done. You know what I mean? Like, we have to teach our kids, not the media, where it's teaching kids like, okay, this is a style that's popular, this is what money gets you. You guys have to, hey, like, I can be a role model to my kid, or any kid, and not just media. I mean, you guys are emphasizing media when we should emphasize us as teachers, not computers, where there's pornographic sites for children, can be easily accessed, where we're safe. We know what information should be told to our children, and stuff like that. And that's what...
And that, I think we would all agree, is a wonderful ideal. Although we know how many hours children spend with media today, and especially latchkey, children. So we do, I think, maybe that's what our emphasis on media is, because we know the levels of consumption are higher today, than they have been in many forms of media.
Teachers are also overworked. We're hearing that in our kids' website all the time. They're saying, we put together features and then questions that teachers can ask in a classroom related to a story. For a while, just expedience, because we get no funding for the kids' site. I mean, zero funding, so it's a labor of love by our organization, and it's expensive. And so we said, this is an area where we can cut back. We just won't give the questions. Teachers started writing in and saying, in theory, I could write those questions, but I don't have the time. Please bring back the questions to stimulate, conversation in our classrooms. So we did. But we know teachers are overworked, and all too many of them in science and math don't have adequate training that they feel comfortable in the classroom, going beyond whatever it was written in the textbook that they're working from. So we're trying to help them. We know that a good teacher is the best resource out there, but a lot of teachers just don't feel they have adequate resources.
But the same thing applies to parents. A parent can use those questions as well. This report on learning science in informal environments, one whole section of it was on learning science in everyday environments. I mean, at home.
Yeah, it means it's really important as a parent to teach kids to think. I mean, I thought the purpose of education was to teach people how to think, and also to look and to observe and to put 2 and 2 together and, maybe come up with 9. I don't know. An experience like watching television, Beacon's World, it becomes substantially more valuable if it's done in a group or with a parent or with, and in terms of interactivity, we tried to have kids participate by writing and asking questions and thinking about that. And maybe it's a drag that they couldn't get everyone's question answered, but, some of them got their question answered. And then also by doing experiments, by, having a list of stuff and kids doing it and getting out and doing it with their parents. So, I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways to make this stuff happen. I also think, this whole thing's about science and communication. And journalists are by nature of what you do, you're communicators, but it's, teachers and those of us who give lectures and all the rest, we don't have good communication skills. I mean, I don't know what communication in college, I don't know what that's all about, what your job is, I don't really understand. I don't know, I don't know, but what I do know is I see people who can't communicate, who should be able to communicate. They can't use PowerPoint. They can't address a crowd. What was the subject I liked the best in school? Speech class. What was the subject that every other kid in the school hated the most? Speech class.
Yeah.
Now, why is that? What's wrong with that? Why did I like it? Because I could talk about anything I wanted. And you already know I like to talk. What happens there? Why can't we teach? Why can't we value that? That's really important. Whether it's the teacher, whether it's the journalist, whether it's anybody, making the eye contact, touching somebody, getting under their skin. That's a lot of what this is about. And I'm into it.
And I can tell you from the communication department, the students who dread that class the most
Are scientists.
scientists.
Really?
The students from the engineering school, and Professor Merkel runs into this every single day. The students that hate this the most are the scientists. Yeah.
So I am a scientist.
It's okay.
So I'm in the physics department, and over the years that I've been here, I've participated in several outreach grants type things to address some of the main problems that you're talking about. Among them, as was pointed out, the National Science Foundation requires that you have some type of outreach plan, so that, trying to encourage this communication. Also, the National Science Foundation, there have been grants, I don't know what the status of it is now, to try to get scientists to learn how to communicate to lay people. One of the grants that took place here involved scientists going into the Jefferson County Public School System, working with teachers, being a resource throughout the entire academic year, working within the classroom with students, and communicating, learning to talk to 7th graders, basically. So, again, another effort along those lines. Now, and as I recall, the measured effect was significant. At least for the classrooms that the school was involved. So these things people do try. There are some efforts. Now, how well those will be funded and all over time, I don't know. But the idea, the hope at least, is that while these grants were in operation, resources were developed that could be used by teachers after the grant ended, perhaps even made available to parents, people who homeschool and things of that nature. So that's there. The other thing, though, is that this idea again of the trying to get the public in some way viewing science in the same way that they might view, entertainers or something, whatever. There have been efforts along those lines as well. As a matter of fact, Leon Letterman, the physicist, he at one point was trying to develop some way to develop television shows that, in some way would generate as much interest among, for science as there had been generated by, in the 90s, I guess, by LA Law for lawyers or something like that, and now for CSI, forensic science by CSI or whatever. The thing is, though, is science on a day-to-day level can be pretty dull. I mean, it's not the life-changing, minute-by-minute
I think
decision.
science is dull. Try being a lawyer. Most lawyers, most of the time, are doing really dull stuff.
But at least they have the cases that they deal with can dramatically affect someone's life, right? And so that, you can make some dramatic arc around that, as opposed to, a program didn't work, or the analysis came up, something different. The thing is, though, just to the point made earlier, that it's a very different life. And so, certainly, the basketball stars, they don't focus on the practices. Actually, sometimes they do. That's still something more active than the typical day-to-day scientist's life. Just again, the ideas mentioned before about getting students involved, not to bore them, but to actually get them involved in doing the projects is the thing to do. And that's what most of these efforts by the National Science Foundation involve, is trying to get them doing this more inquiry-based methods in education, trying to get them into some situation where they have the experience of sort of engaging their minds to figure out a puzzle. Because once, if you think of it in terms of this big game, well, that becomes very interesting, and maybe they'll pursue it a little bit more. And so, trying to do that, both at home, at the schools, and maybe through some type of public discourse among professional scientists and all, that should be, I think, the goal. And how to bring it about, I guess, is the issue.
Could I just say one thing?
Sure.
On that? This is great, what you just said. And I just want to reinforce it a little bit by two things that we're trying to do in Boston. One of them, as in my university and others as well, all the freshmen are encouraged to go to your professors and try to get involved in a research project. Whether you are in the arts or in biology, to get a sense and talk about dull. You know what you do as a freshman in a research project. It's just, oh my God, talk about the lack of romance. But they start seeing what it's like. And I've had so many people change because of those kinds of research, more innovative projects that they get involved in. So really, our president is just saying, as many research projects, and the faculty, pre-tenure too, are really encouraged to do and even publish things with an undergrad. The second thing that's quite interesting in Boston, and I'm just going to suggest it for Louisville. So we are now going into high schools in groups of 3. So I go as the cognitive neuroscientist, I have a buddy who's a neurologist, and we have a neurobiologist. And we go into high school, and who was I talking to? Was it you? Yes, you know what I'm talking about. So, they don't want to know about the brain. They really don't, but they want to know about soccer. So I have these 2 guys doing soccer and saying what the teenage brain does when they play soccer. So suddenly, the brain's not so bad, right? Or useful. But the point was that the kids are seeing just us talking no more than 30 minutes apiece. And we go to, quite a few high schools. Now you have to be post-tenure. You cannot go do that. But, and we can't do that often, but if just little groups, we really do a lot of high schools. And that makes a difference. I have literally been at soccer games. This is no kidding. My son plays soccer. Soccer games, and kids will come up and say, I'm going into neuroscience. I'm like, oh my God! I feel like Mr. Beekman. Yeah, it helps. It's little, but it all helps.
So one thing that I'm trying to figure out is exactly what is it that is wanted to be communicated about science? Because it seems like for a little while, the impression I got from this discussion, and my area is astronomy and the history of astronomy. And so astronomy is something that people think is cool. You know, they like to look at telescopes, okay, and look at planets. And so for a little while, the discussion seemed to be like, well, you know, knowledge of science is just good. You know, we need to talk about stuff, you know, to keep that up. But just so there's my neighbor, a couple of doors back from me, but when he brought up the idea of sort of promoting science, boy, everybody backed off of that like, you know, everybody was just, well, no, you know, I mean, no, we're not promoting science, you know, we're not selling science. And so I'm sort of thinking, okay, no, so what is it that, you know, what is it that we want? You know, do we want to promote science? Do we want people to understand, to have basic understanding of science? Do we want them to understand how science works, sort of on like a fundamental level? So, you know, do we want people to know what current cool things are going on in modern science? That's a pretty different, I mean, you know, the thing about the protein foldings and stuff like that. You know, that's not, you know, that's a different thing than sort of figuring out the sort of elementals and how science works. Do we want people to be able to make scientifically smart decisions, you know, so that we have good energy policies and things like that? I mean, it sounds to me like these things are all over the place that are being talked about, and I can't see that it's that. I can't see that that this is pointing in any particular direction.
The answer is all of those things. We want to have all of those things. It's not one or the other. It's not, you know, a choice. We should be doing and helping people do all of those things.
And I don't think we were backing off of promoting science. You were specifically talking about justifying funding.
Well,
that's a different question entirely than promoting an understanding of science.
But
Promoting your justification of your money is, you know.
well, I'm not even talking specifically any one particular area of science. I was talking the benefits of science in general to the general public. I mean,
That's what I took
whether I
away.
get funded or not, you know, as an individual, sure, it affects me. But as an overall, you know, scope of everybody and everybody's benefit, it probably doesn't really matter. There's plenty of other people doing infectious disease research and stuff like that. That doesn't matter. How do we go ahead and let people know that it is important to fund these things, and not just from
No, you talked about funding again, and our job is the public understanding of science, and that's different. The understanding of science.
Well, how do we get them to
The public figures out what to do with that science, you know, the value of that science. It's not something that
Well,
we
because
do.
you also write, so you write journalistic pieces, but you also write blogs which have opinion, which I know you guys talked about in your talks earlier, was that the blogs can provide opinion. The blogs can also, you know, if you have a particular point you want to get across, you can get that across in your blog that you can't get across in a journalistic piece. So I think in a way you guys do have a role in helping.
That's a commentary, and certain journalists will steer clear of that. We've got a whole, you know, spectrum here in terms of communication. And so, I mean, I guess I was hearing you ask, how could, for example, the media do that? And frankly, the media shouldn't do that.
Yeah, and I understand that.
But communicators can, and certainly all
And
people
this
on that side of the table can do
I was
that.
thinking as a
Should do that.
scientific communication roundtable, not necessarily you as journalists, but as communicators of science. How can we affect this sort of, because I don't know, I mean, I don't, just like was said earlier, scientists aren't very good communicators.
So that's where you can start. Seriously.
Yeah. So, I mean, I teach a workshop somewhat similar to the one Carl talked about that he does. And one of the things that happens is my students in that workshop practice a little bit of making blog posts. So as scientists, creating research blogs. Most of them do it for my class, say, that's it. After that weekend is over, they don't do it anymore. A couple of them keep doing it for a little while longer. And one of them, who started it in this class about 4 years ago, kept on doing it while he finished his PhD. Eventually, he was an astronomer, Ryan Anderson, and eventually his blog got picked up by the American Geophysical Union, and is now that he's doing a postdoc, he still blogs, often talking about what he sees as the value of things. And it's on the AGU few sites, so he doesn't have to sort of try to promote it himself. And one of his entries was picked up by the science blogging, what's it called, Open Laboratory, the collection of sort of the best blog posts of the year. So part of this sort of ecology of multiple sites. So here's just a concrete example of what you can do, taking some of these same tools, blogs, Twitter posts, the science blog site that Maren was briefly on before PepsiGate, has many, if not most, of the people on that and some of the other sites are scientists.
One of the problems, I could just quickly say, this question of like justifying science on a broad scale in Congress where funding decisions are made. I mean, that's not something that as a local journalist, I don't cover Congress very often, and when I do, it's a long ways away. And I've seen this happen as an environmental reporter. All of a sudden, a parallel explanation or a parallel situation is the climate change issue passes out of the hands of the science and environmental journalists, goes into the hands of the White House press corps, goes into the hands of the people that cover Congress. They don't have experience, the background, whatever. It's a whole different ecosystem over there, and sometimes things are lost. So, it's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different arenas where scientists are trying to get money. I mean, I think we're talking about a specific project. The way it's typically done is you pitch your case to the granting agencies based on scientific merit, where scientists are the ones doing the judging, and that's for your project. If you're talking about getting funding for science in general, I don't think it's the job of scientists to be lobbying Congress for particular projects that they want to do. Now, if you want to promote science as an area, I think that's different. And I don't think it's right for scientists to lobby Congress for money for their particular pet project.
So, a couple of y'all, when I asked that question, said sort of everything on those. And I do a lot of public work at our observatory, and I teach a class that is a wide open introductory astronomy class. So I spend, and this is in Kentucky, and where education's perhaps not the best in the country. So I talk to a lot of people who know very little about science, but like science a lot. And so I'm very skeptical of the ability to use journalism and stuff like that as a means of reaching sort of the broad public. If you're talking about, we want to reach more of the people who are going, we want to produce more astronomers, we want to produce more chemists, stuff like that. We want for economic development or what have you, to reach that select group. I can see that. But you would not believe the stuff that people, that people believe. I mean, it is because a lot of people don't know anything about the basics of science. And so if they read something really cool in Science News or something like that, I mean, it may as well be a recipe for a spell out of Hogwarts that they think is cool. They know nothing about it.
But I don't think anybody here said that science journalism would substitute for science education. And we didn't say that, and the reason I point that out is like I hear that sort of that attitude a lot. People will be like, well, we depend on you to educate us. And I'm, what? I mean, and I was like, and it really bothers me. It bothers me so much sometimes I kind of lose my cool. So I was at this event where I was with Eric Kandel, guy won the Nobel Prize for memory. I mean, big time researcher. So then we were there at this discussion, and he just, he was getting a prize for a book that he had written, and I was getting a prize for journalism, and he was like, oh, it's just so important what these people are doing, because we really depend on you to educate us. And I just looked at him and was like, no, you don't. That's totally wrong. What are you talking about? Science teachers. And I was like, what have I just done? You don't shut your mouth out like that. Yeah, I mean, but it just got me so riled up. I just think it's no one should have that attitude. No one should have. There's no way that science journalism could substitute for good science education. And we've talked about how science education leaves a lot to be desired in this country.
So So when I mentioned all those different things, though, I mean, a general reaction that I got of the Symposium was what all of those should be included in. I mean, one of the things I mentioned was that sort of fundamental understanding of science. So you would not put that in.
Yes, but in a different sense, not in the sense like education in a classroom. It's like we're sort of, in a sense, continuing education for adults. The same way you get continuing education on your, economics or your political system or on anything. Once you leave school, you still have to learn things in order to be an active and participant in society, to make good decisions, vote for people correctly, so that they achieve your, goals, whatever those are. And we offer some of the information, some of the understanding of the issues and the, processes that might govern decision-making and good policies. So we're part of the continuing education, not the whole thing, and certainly not for, education of kids, but we're there to help provide some additional information and that public understanding of science, which is not the same science as when we went to school. It's a different science today, and it's going to be a different science 5 years from now. So science is always changing, and if you're left with whatever you grew up in school learning about science, it's antiquated within a year or two. We're trying to help you stay abreast of just some of the little bits with cues to where you can find out more if you're interested.
So, in the almost exactly 60 years ago, the American Association for the Advancement of Science had a conference to talk about its mission statement, basically. I'm not sure they put it in those terms then, but today we would call it a mission statement discussion. And in particular, they re-emphasized a line in their goals, which said that their objective was to increase the public appreciation of the benefits that science provides to society. And it turns out that if you look in a lot of places, including writings of science journalists in the 1950s, not today, but in the 1950s, there was an equation of the term public understanding of science and public appreciation of the benefits that science provides to society. This tension between what exactly is the role of journalism, is it about understanding, is it about appreciation, is it about education, is a long-standing tension. It's not one we're going to resolve tonight. It's not one that anybody here is going to resolve in their career. This is part of the variety of different kinds of journalism and different kinds of outreach and different kinds of edutainment that we've seen, that I think we need to recognize that complexity. We're looking for a simple answer, and as usual, there is no simple answer.
So why not? I mean, historically speaking, science has been is something that has been done by people who are interested in science, and it's not. Even this will sound a little strange from someone who does a lot of public outreach, but is it perhaps, would it simply be more efficient, more useful to focus the discussion of science? This is going to sound really snotty, but to keep it among to keep it in the scientific community, so to speak, that remain that old-fashioned 19th century club. And, talk about it with your fellow scientists, over a cigar.
So one of the most prominent science journalists of the last half century is a guy named Daniel Greenfield, who started at Science Magazine, eventually was at the Washington Post, maybe it was at the Post and then at the Science Magazine, and eventually became a freelancer, but a long-standing freelancer. And in 1963, he convinced AAAS, as sort of 10 years after that, obviously, that they needed to start a new magazine, in addition to Science Magazine, that was going to be about science policy. Because, as his opening statement said, decisions about science and science policy are too important to be left just to scientists. The magazine was killed after the first issue by the leaders of the AAAS, precisely on that question. Maybe we should just keep these discussions in among ourselves. That was when he left science and went freelance.
Okay, you've had your hand up for a very long time. I think this will be our last chance, and then we'll thank our guests and maybe exchange emails or something for the rest of the group. So go ahead.
This was kind of alluded to, but following up on that, is that what's happening, given that so much of your work is moving numbers, which had a broader distribution to these blogs and Twitter feeds that are maybe more of a narrow, self-selecting audience that are the people who are already interested? And if so, are there other venues on the internet, I'm thinking about YouTube channels and things like that, that might have a broader reach for some of the science communication? The one specific example I was thinking of in terms of the kind of celebrity scientists is the Symphony of Science videos on the YouTube videos.
Well, we didn't talk about YouTube at all. All throughout today, we didn't mention it, and yet YouTube I find fascinating for science. You can find all sorts of things there, and things that can be successful in unexpected ways. You have, for example, Khan Academy, where you just have like videos of someone doing arithmetic and massive hits. You have a video about a honey badger, which I won't go into a lot of detail, except to say that like 14 million people have watched it, and many of those people, including myself, have learned a lot about honey badgers from very unexpected source. So, and YouTube is also fantastic for crisp, elegant rebuttals of creationism and global warming denialism. So there are a lot of these channels with great potential, I think.
I think the question seems to be is when does something go from being very kind of narrow casting to a blog that specializes in, I don't know, one particular type of sandwich or something, and then it's to spreading out, going virally across the universe. In the olden days, you'd have these big media outlets that would be able to broadcast that and kind of control the agenda. And now it's much more democratic in some ways, and you don't have the control over it. But you think of the role of the social networking and just the Occupy Wall Street right now, and Occupy everything, Occupy the Tundra. I saw one came across my Facebook page. There's somebody standing up in the tundra with the sign saying "Occupy the Tundra." So I don't know how that all works and everything, but that seems to be where it's all headed. Somehow these individual, somehow somebody must be organizing this somehow. I have no idea, but it's at some point it gels and everybody's getting it, and that becomes the fireplace hearth that we used to have with Walter Cronkite, but it's just different. I don't know.
One of my concerns is that everything is getting so splintered in terms of delivery of information, and you can't have eyeballs on everything.
But see, then it comes together. Every now and then it's splintered, but then it just coalesces.
But you need to have some coalescing, otherwise people only look at what they want to look at, which means they need to know about it, to know to look for it in the first place, and it also means they lose the serendipity of putting their eyeballs on something they never knew they'd like, but in fact will love, or will, make their blood boil or something. But the point is we should be exposed to things we didn't know existed. And if it becomes so fractured and it's done thematically, you're never going to find the stuff you didn't know because you didn't know to look for it. So that's why it really helps to have some kind of eclectic outlet that's sort of broad and that you can't totally choose things. We've got this new iPad edition to look more like a magazine, so that when you go into it, you still flip through it like you did in an old magazine. Because if you went in the old style, just online, you get a list of headlines, and if the headline didn't, turn you on, you never saw the things between that and the next one. You didn't find that story that was going to grab you and hook you, a picture that hooked you, something else that hooked you on the way that you never knew you were going to like, and it totally turns you on. We need to be able to still find that serendipity, and if everything is one topic, it's here, and you have to go to look for it, we're going to miss the world. And that's what I worry about. Now, I don't know how we get around that as the world keeps splintering, unless there's some aggregator that somehow pulls it.
I think we need newspapers.
And on that note,
Science section,
that's right.
Monday